Hello, everybody. Thought I'll just start off whilst there's still probably people joining us. Really nice to see you all on the chat. If you're able to join in the chat, it's just nice to feel that we're kind of a community and we can see who's here and just kind of, I don't know. I know it's just a small thing, but it still feels more connected, particularly for me, than just talking to a screen. Great, yeah. My dad had his first jab this morning as well, so that was really good news for our family, and he's the first one, so yeah, ahead of the game. He's also the oldest one. I guess that's why he's the first one. So just really nice to know that he's had it, because my family are down in the southeast, inside the M25, most of them. So it's quite high levels there. So it's nice to know that they're being looked after. What a day. Wet snow. Really lovely out the window. Less nice when you were in it. Although, yeah, I don't know. Gail and Grace, was there more settled up at where you are? I'm assuming I don't know, are you in Chester or are you in Belbusk? If you're in Belbusk, I don't know if the snow was kind of more up there than it is down in Skipton. It's always a bit more kind of mushy. Stephen Moira, I guess you were snowed in where you are as well. Does Jess like snow? Jess absolutely loves snow. I guess Toby likes snow. Toby just likes life, doesn't he? Yeah, she loves snow. Although I couldn't get to walk down into town because it was too wet and cold under her feet. She just stopped and wouldn't go any further. So good to see you all joining in. Yeah, got Malcolm and Tony Gudgeon sneaking in there, and Alan, maybe Karen as well, and Rob and Chloe. So just really nice to see you all tonight. And we'll just let a few people join in, because I know what it's like, and you suddenly go, where's the link and how do I find it? And it always takes people a few moments. So yeah. Evening, Barry. Lovely to have you on with us tonight. I know because I've spoken to Barry that he was with us last week. He was just being quiet. Well, Ella, I think that's actually quite a good question. Is anyone clapping? I don't know. It seems to have gone a little political, maybe the right word to use. Yeah. So yeah. Oh, Simon, you got loads of snow up there. Excellent. Cool. So all good. Oh, I need a Bible. That would be really good, wouldn't it? Where is my Bible? There it is. It's always good, isn't it? You get all the computer and your notes and everything else, and then you go, oh, a Bible would be excellent, actually. So I hope you've all got one as well. It's quite a long chapter tonight. So you might want to just find it. Where are you, Daniel? There you are. Right. It's a really long chapter. Okay, we might be settling in for about the next 4 hours. So I just warn you, that 4 hours needs to be squished into 1 hour though, so we can watch Death in Paradise at 9 o'clock. Though, just like doing that. Just as we kind of get going, so last week somebody asked a question at the end, which was, when was the book written? And were there 2 editions? I know that many of you have been wrestling with that thought during this week. So I thought that I'd really, really briefly, because we've got so much to cover already tonight, just kind of mention what the thoughts are. And I mean, I do mean really briefly, and the person who asked has probably already looked at these things. So, and it may be that over the next weeks, there's a better opportunity to look at things a little bit more detail, or to point you in the right direction for that. But it's kind of always good to kind of have a think about these things. So apparently, to be honest, this seems to have passed me by quite well for most of my life. the date of the book of Daniel is one of the most hotly contested themes in Old Testament scholarship. I'm not quite sure how it passed me by, but anyway, it seems to have done. And two main views prevailed. The first one is this. In fact, I think the second one is probably the first one. Is that it was written in the 6th century BC in Babylon by a Jewish exile named Daniel, who served in the royal court and accurately predicted events that were not fulfilled until the 2nd century. I mean, that's the kind of view of we believe what it says on the tin. You know, it's called the Book of Daniel, and it's the story of people in Babylon in the 6th century. Therefore, we simply believe that that's the case, and we don't stress about it too much. The other view is that the book was written in the 2nd century BC in Judea in order to encourage the people of Israel who were undergoing persecution by the Seleucids under a guy who had the great name of Antiochus Epiphanes, who technically was Antiochus IV Epiphanes, and was in that sense written after the event, obviously, of Daniel in Babylon. And it was kind of written as a way of encouraging people to stay faithful in the face of persecution. And some of the stuff that we're looking at tonight, and some of the things that we'll be looking at in the coming weeks, are a kind of a storytelling of what has happened rather than a prophetic view of what is to come. And it doesn't actually detract from really God being involved in it. It's just a different perspective on it. And I mean, another view is that some of it is in Aramaic and some of it's in Hebrew, and there's a kind of a mush of the two things together. So there's lots of detail which point to both, which is always really helpful, isn't it? So, you know, if you want to argue one position, you pretty effectively can do that, and if you want to argue the other position, you can pretty effectively do that. I guess there's another view is to say that there was a story written in the 6th century BC, and then that story was taken and used in a particularly encouraging fashion in the 2nd century BC. One of the things that is interesting, I think, is that it was always categorized as part of the writings in the Torah rather than the prophets. But of course, things are not as simple as they seem, and we see many prophecies or words of prophecy in Genesis and Deuteronomy and all sorts of other places, not just in the prophets themselves. So there you go. That's the little kind of thought as we start tonight. And I say there's lots of different stuff about that if you are interested in following that up. I also wanted just to touch, before we read the passage, on something that I've used many times before in various different contexts, but it's some work by Stuart Murray Williams. He's written a lot about what we call now post-Christendom, with a kind of concept of the exile being a metaphor for the church today. And in fact, this was written a few years ago, so it's not like it was written right in this context now. But he summarizes 7 key transitions which mark out that transition between Christendom, which obviously, you know, was when the world was broadly Christian. Sorry, not the world. The UK was broadly Christian, and to a place where we are now, which feels more like the church in exile. So I just think it's kind of an interesting thing as a background to how we read and understand the book of Daniel, and maybe to what God is saying to us now as his church. So these are the transitions, and I'm not going to comment a lot on them. So if you know, take what you want. From the center to the margins. So in Christendom, the Christian story and the churches were central, but in post-Christendom, they are marginal. From the majority to the minority. In Christendom, Christians comprise the often overwhelming majority, but in post-Christendom, we are a minority. From settlers to sojourners. In Christendom, Christians felt at home in a culture shaped by their story, but in post-Christendom, we are aliens, exiles, and pilgrims in a culture in which we no longer feel at home. From privilege to plurality. In Christendom, Christians enjoyed many privileges, but in post-Christendom, we are one community among many in a plural society. From control to witness. In Christendom, churches could exert control over society, but in post-Christendom, we exercise influence only through our witnessing to our story and its implications. From maintenance to mission. In Christendom, the emphasis was on maintaining a supposedly Christian status quo, but in post-Christendom, it is on mission within a contested environment. And the final one is from institution to movement. In Christendom, churches operated mainly in institutional mode, but in post-Christendom, we must again become a Christian movement. As I say, that was a number of years ago that he wrote that, and you can read his book, Stuart Murray Williams, Post-Christendom, if you're more interested to look at that. And of course, the speed of change has only escalated hugely in this last heading towards 12 months, really. And so any of those things that he said really, a huge tipping point there, really, in terms of how the church is perceived, our position in society, how society is, and the formation of our society by a Christian worldview has obviously shifted hugely. And although we have, some influence, especially at the moment, in fact, which is brilliant, through things like Food Bank and CAP and so on, actually there is a sense in which we're on the margins compared to where the church was placed in society 100 years ago, but even less than that as well. So that's kind of the backdrop. Little kind of quiz thing, not a quiz, question to get you started, and to see how honest you are. What are you afraid of? So that's my first question. So you might want to type some thoughts into the chat. What are you afraid of? Those of you that know me over any time at all will know that I don't like being in confined spaces, and even watching caving on the television can send me into some kind of squirming mess, because I just, everything goes wrong inside me when I think about being in a confined space. Hi Judith, nice to see you. Martin Stowe, scorpions. You have a lot of those at the top end of Skipton. Heights, yeah, I think that's quite common, isn't it? Rats. Slipping over on ice, yes, I hate slipping as well, just slippering anything. Spiders, roller coasters. Peter, I didn't know that. I love you. I'm scared of roller coasters too. I thought you were like a brave person, but you're not. You're like me. Uncontrolled speed, Beth. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought that was Andy. Losing to Manchester United, Steve Hudson. Tony Gudgeon, frogs. That's an unusual one. Mice, the dark. Yes, that again, lots of people anxious about the dark. Rats. Alan Cobold, you're with Steve. You're not allowed to be with Steve. You're supposed to be socially distanced in your own home. Slippery Styles. Yes, I think Peter Smith would also follow that one, and I think Vicky had an encounter with the slippery style this week as well. So Simon's gone for the more deep one. We're going to move on to that in a moment. Andy's scared of controlled speed. Snakes. Is that a duck, Corey? Or is it a bird, like a general bird? Chickens and little animals that move quickly. Height with no way down. Well, some interesting things in there, aren't there? There's a lot of things that a lot of us are scared of, actually, and those are just the things that we've kind of owned. And there is the kind of the deeper one, isn't it, as well? Speaking on stage, yeah, I don't like doing that either. It was meant to be a snake. It looks really suspiciously like a duck. Mike's being way out of his depth in the sea. It's that whole you don't know what's underneath you kind of thing, isn't it? And the Jaws music starts playing in your ears at that point, of course, as well. Then there are the more deep things, aren't there? The things that are less easy to maybe put in a chat, because this is not about necessarily a huge amount of self-revelation, unless you want to do that. But there are the deeper things that we feel concerned about. And you feel free to put those things. I think many people feel that, particularly people in my role and maybe in other kind of roles of a similar nature, feel that they are going to get found out. It even has a name, doesn't it? Imposter syndrome. And I think in many areas of our lives, we can feel that we struggle with imposter syndrome. There's that whole kind of, I mean, I think lots of people feel anxious about going into new situations or social situations, anxious that they won't know what to say, that people won't like them, that they'll feel stupid or they'll do something stupid. I think in this current time, there's a lot of fear of the unknown. I think it would be reasonable to say that many of us are frightened of COVID, because we see what happens to some people, so we feel afraid of that. Peter Smith is afraid of cheese. Getting kind of concerned about you, Peter, actually. Just saying. Yeah, Beth agrees with the imposter syndrome. It's that feeling of responsibility, isn't it, that you won't know what to do. People are afraid of being alone. People are afraid of getting ill. People are afraid of dying. That's kind of the world that we are in, isn't it? And if you do a Google search, you put in the first bit of the sentence, and yeah, Ella, I'm sure you have. You put in the first bit of the sentence, and then it comes up with some predictive options, which is actually often quite helpful, because sometimes you can't quite remember what it is you're looking for, or you can't remember somebody's surname or something, and so it gives you some options. And if you type in, I'm scared of, I wonder what comes up there. I wonder what you might find. And we have anxiety because we don't have control over our lives. And if this year has taught us anything, it's particularly that, isn't it? That we have little control over our lives. It was an imaginary control, really. And as Christians at this point in our history, what might we be afraid of? And I guess this passage helps us to see our moment in history through an eternal lens, and to maybe be a little more like Daniel, and to trade our fears and anxieties. And let's be honest, we all have them. It doesn't mean we have them all the time, but we have them, for a humble and courageous confidence in the light of what we're going to see in this passage. I love looking at all these little things. So Chloe, apart from being scared of ducks or maybe snakes, holes in rocks and what might be lurking inside, and yeah, Mike's agreed with that, and eels hiding in the holes in rocks when snorkeling. Yeah, Mike, have we ever seen an eel, or is it just something that we feel anxious about? And Simon said, I'm scared of what you say, which is what honestly came up in the predictive text. Maybe that wasn't a good suggestion in that case. So let's read a bit at the passage. We may do it in chunks, I'm thinking, because it's quite lengthy. So and I'm hoping that maybe some of you have had a chance to read it, and that many of you have some understanding of what the story is. Anyway, so are you ready? Daniel chapter 2. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I've had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream and we will interpret it. I mean, it seems reasonable, doesn't it? The king replied to the astrologers, This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me. Once more they replied, Let the king tell his servants the dream and we will interpret it. Then the king answered, I am certain that you are trying to gain time. Probably. Because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me. The astrologers answered the king, There is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asked is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, Why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went into the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to the house and explained the matter to his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him. Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Daniel replied, No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you lay on your bed are these. And we'll maybe read the rest of it in a moment or two. So we kind of have in this chapter a real contrast between Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, really, don't we? So here we have the great king, the super ruler of his day, the top 20 most powerful, probably one of the top 20 most powerful people to have ever lived in world history. So, you know, we're talking significant here. But in chapter 2, we meet Nebuchadnezzar in a form that we don't expect. He's got this dream, this prevailing dream. And he says, Tell me the dream and interpret it. And you sense here that this world leader, this superpower leader, is actually not quite as in control as he wants everyone to believe. There's a kind of a nervousness and out of controlness. He might have military might and fame and power and wealth, but in his soul, he is a deeply troubled man. And his insecurity is leading to increasing hostility, a loss of trust in others, and he begins to do crazy things. What's your news? An inability to control the future can lead us to do some strange things. And when we look around us now, and also in historical terms, we see that though people are in positions of wealth and power and fame, they can move into a position of doing some very, very strange things. And we know, don't we, that some of the most powerful leaders are also some of the most insecure and neurotic. And so we only need to look at North Korea, which yet again is number one on Open Doors World Watch list as the most difficult place to be a follower of Jesus in the world. In fact, the top three are unchanged: North Korea, Afghanistan, and Somalia. And, you know, we see in the leadership of North Korea just that extreme power and authority, and then complete neurosis and insecurity. And if anyone steps up against that leader, then they're just removed from the scene, probably literally. We see it to some degree in Putin, in Russia, and there were some documentaries about him a number of months ago, which were so interesting, and just exactly looked at this kind of topic here of someone who has great power but massive insecurity. I think that's been seen in Belarus recently as well. We look back in time, that's exactly what we saw with Stalin and Hitler. It's what we have seen with some of the Chinese leaders, and it is what we are beginning to see again as China finds itself number 17 on the World Watch List, I think. It's the first time that it's been in the top 20 for several decades now. And this leader will most probably be in charge for at least another 10 years. But there's an insecurity and there's an out of controlness, and the Church of Jesus Christ is growing exponentially, 7% a year in China. And that means that there are now more Christians than there are members of the Communist Party. Well, if you're a powerful leader, that makes you incredibly insecure, doesn't it? And this is the moment to clamp down and to do wild and reckless and slightly mad things in order to maintain your control. And I really want to try and avoid mentioning Trump tonight, but you can fill in the gaps for yourself on that. But actually, even in the recesses of our own hearts, because it's really easy to project out to big world characters, when we feel out of control, when we feel that the things that make us feel secure and confident are being removed from us, it's really easy to want to gather them all back in again and take control and just fix everything. And even if that means that we stamp on other people, or as we go about there, we can see that in ourselves. We don't need to look to these kind of famous world leaders to see that as well. We can see it in ourselves. So last week we were talking a little bit around what we might call intrinsic faith, the faith that Daniel had in Jerusalem, that he and his friends were able to also express in Babylon, their confidence in God. And in this chapter, I guess what we're looking at, so I've been reading a whole bunch of things and I've taken from a whole bunch of different people, but one person calls it acoustic faith. And mainly because he's talking about what we might describe as double listening. This is what Daniel does. He listens on both sides. He listens to the culture and he listens to God, and that's a real key lesson for us to learn, isn't it? And what he's able to do is he's able to take the story of Yahweh and not to make God more palatable to the pagans, in fact the opposite really, but actually to discern the points of contact between the story that is embedded within him and what he sees in Babylon. And it's interesting how people have done that with all sorts of stories, and maybe you will be able to think of some yourself. I think that the one that is, what's the word? Reinvented, if that's, I don't think that is the word, but more often than any other that I could think of, and I was trying to think of some others, is the story of Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's like, you know, the ultimate love story, tragedy. And we see that in different shapes, don't we? So West Side Story, the musical, is the story of Romeo and Juliet, really, but written into a different context of New York and different understandings, and just to kind of make that story live again in its new context. Some of you may have seen Baz Luhrmann's film Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes, I think it was. Again, putting it in a completely different context, almost using Shakespeare's script entirely, but being able to express it into a different kind of cultural context, so that new people watching it could go, I get that, I understand it now, in a way that maybe when they had to read Shakespeare at school they didn't get it. And at a very different level, the story of Romeo and Juliet is in a children's film called Romeo and Juliet. But it's the same story. It's the same story, communicating the same messages about conflict between families and what happens when the wrong people fall in love with each other and how that's worked out. So I don't know if you've got any other thoughts around that, of stories that we see reinvented for a different time in a different culture to help us to understand them differently. I think some of the others of Shakespeare's stories have been put onto BBC dramas as well, to get in the kind of the main themes of the stories, and just helping to find those points of connection, so that it's not just a dusty old book on a shelf, but something that speaks into the common human condition. And that's what Daniel's doing, isn't it? He is taking the story of God. Please feel free to write in the chat if you think of anything else. He's taking the story of God and he's saying, well, how can I connect this story to this alien, pagan culture? How might an ambitious king who sees himself at the epicenter of global history be persuaded of the sovereignty of God? How does Jerusalem's God speak on the streets of Babylon? And Daniel is going to be driven by his faithfulness, but also by improvisation. He has an ancient and future faith, and we really see that. Evan Almighty. It's a great film, though, isn't it? It really communicates some really important things. I think my favorite bit is when he thinks that he can answer all the prayers, and he just says, so if you haven't seen it, he's going to be kind of God for a day or whatever it is, and he says, "Oh, I'm going to answer all the prayers, and why would God ever say no? So I'm just going to say yes to everything." And of course, there's a person praying for rain at the same point as a person praying for sun, and it just gets overwhelmingly confusing. Rob Heskin, Oliver, yeah, I guess. Are you thinking in terms of the book being turned into a musical? I don't. It's not. Sorry, Dickens is not my favourite. So if you've got other thoughts around that, let me know what you're thinking there. And he's taken this ancient future faith that is true to the oldness of God, of the story, but the newness of his context, and speaking into that, and it's really important. And we've. So the team normally go to Fresh Streams conference this week every year. And of course we couldn't do that this year. So it's been online. So I have spent a huge amount of time on the computer in the last 3 days. But the theme was Back to the Future, and taking that verse from Jeremiah 6:16 about being at the crossroads and looking for the ancient ways, and following them. Thanks, Gail. It's Bruce Almighty, the one I was talking about. Evan Almighty is about the ark. I'd forgotten. And it's that thing where we're now at the crossroads. We have the ancient ways, but where do we go? What do ancient ways look like in 2021? And it's like this double listening. The prophets offer their lives as a bridge between heaven and their context or culture. But there's always a specific place for that. The incarnation is specific. Jesus was a man in a place at a time. And the story of Daniel is very specific into the culture and context of Babylon. We might want to shift forward a few centuries and talk about Paul finding himself in Athens in Acts chapter 17, and taking the altar of the unknown God and then referring them to their own poets. It's that thing about Paul finds himself in that moment, and he's listening to God and he's listening to the context in Athens, and he's taking those things and saying, how can I connect these two things together? And that's a really critical function of every follower of Jesus and of the church, however that might look at any point in any culture, is how do we bring those two things together? How do we listen to God and to knowing his story and his ways? And how do we listen to our culture and our context, and we speak into that? And I think one of the things in good missionary stories is that there's a huge amount of work goes into that. Learning a language, learning about patterns and rituals and behavior, learning about culture, learning about what's important to people, and then taking the story of Jesus and learning how to communicate that. Well, we need that same level of effort in order to communicate into our own culture. Arguably, it should be a little bit easier because we kind of speak the language and we kind of understand it. But it's not always that easy, is it? And we need to make that effort to hear on both sides, God and our context. So in Daniel 2, we're reading about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. That was all by way of introduction, but the introduction is probably longer than anything else. Yeah, the peace child, Sue. Yeah, great example there of being able to communicate the story of Jesus into a really challenging tribal context. It's a lovely story if you haven't read that before. And Nebuchadnezzar challenges his magicians, his sorcerers, everyone. He says, "Tell me the dream and tell me what it means." Despite their protests, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't really ask that much of them. I mean, these men made their living from their supposed ability to contact the gods. That was what they were about, and gain their secrets from the spirit realm. And if they were really who they claimed to be, they should be able to do what Nebuchadnezzar's asking them. He's not super friendly, is he? He says, if you can't do this, you're going to be cut into pieces. This method of behavior and execution is perfectly consistent with the character of ancient Near Eastern monarchs. So if you don't like horrible things, close your ears for a moment. One of the commentators described one method of dismemberment. We just need to get a sense of what this guy's like. 4 trees were bent inwards and tied together at the top. The victim was tied to those 4 trees with a rope on each limb. Then the top rope was cut and the body snapped into 4 pieces. I know that's not pleasant, but we need to understand what Daniel was dealing with and the kind of punishment that would be meted out to these guys if they displeased him. And the strategy of the wise men, so-called, was to convince the king that he was being unreasonable rather than that they were being incompetent. He was angry, he was furious, and even though he was a despot, he knew that false religion was worse than useless. And he wanted wise men who could hear from the gods or God. And so he said, well, if you can't do this, I'm going to kill all of you. Now, it may have been, because this is the 2nd year of his reign, arguably still when Daniel and his mates are in training, that he was going to use the situation to test the suitability of his father's old advisors and potentially have a clean house, start again, get rid of all those old guys and start again with his own favoured advisors, which is what we find powerful leaders have a tendency to do, and even less powerful ones. So Arioch visits the wise men to tell them what's going on with this king, who's somewhat of an insecure maniac at this point. And Daniel is amazing, isn't he? He's so calm. I mean, it really shows what kind of a man he is. What is that phrase? Is it the crisis do not make the man, but they reveal the man? I mean, it's true, isn't it? In a crisis, we find out what's actually going on inside us, and we see with Daniel what kind of man he was. And he asked the king for time, which hasn't gone that well with the other advisors, but for some reason or other, he was confident. He came and said, if you give me time, I can do this. And of course, he wants time to listen to the Lord. He needs time to do that one-sided waiting, doesn't he? To actively speak to God and say, I need to know what's going on here. My life's at stake. Our lives are at stake. And he was in a situation where only God could meet his needs. He knew how important it was for him and his companions to pray. And I think that, that's pretty much the first thing he does, isn't he? He goes back to them and says, can you pray with me? And there's a confidence in the way that he speaks to the king, but humility in the way that he speaks to God, and that he worships God and listens to him. And God reveals the secret of the dream to Daniel in a night vision. So let's have a little read of the rest of that chapter, shall we? 20 minutes to do this. We'll be fine. So where are we? Verse 29. As you were lying there, O king, your mind turned to the things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation, and that you may understand what went through your mind. You looked, O king, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were broken to pieces at the same time and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace, but the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. You, O king, are the King of kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands he has placed mankind and the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler over them all. You are that head of gold. It's really great when you're given the answer in the Bible, isn't it? After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks things to pieces, so it will crush and break all the others. Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strength of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly iron and partly clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of a mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold to pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and the interpretation is trustworthy. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor, and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon, placed him in charge of all its wise men. And moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So, here we go. So God reveals the secret of the dream. So Alan, Daniel was still probably a teenager. We mentioned that last week. Probably, maybe a young teenager. And Simon, I like that. People are like tea bags. Find out what they're like when you put them in hot water. Well, Daniel was most definitely in hot water here, wasn't he? But in verse 20, we find that he praises God. There's this beautiful kind of almost like a prayer psalm from verse 20. And he approaches the king and he tells him that it's God that's made known to him, both the dream and its interpretation. And he honors God. And he reports the content, which of course gives credibility to the interpretation, which is part of the reason that Nebuchadnezzar wants to know what the content is from his wise men, because he doesn't want them to just make up some rubbish to suit themselves, which is safe for them. And the interpretation of this dream is most definitely not safe, is it? And Daniel tells him the dream. He gives him the interpretation of it, to the amazement of Nebuchadnezzar. And I think this is a pretty scary dream to declare, isn't it? Personally, I think if I'd been praying and God had given me this dream, I might have possibly missed out the bit which said, that the head was Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom and it wasn't going to last. It was hard to say the things that were true about the dream. The king's seen this great image, head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, with legs of iron and feet mixed with iron and clay. And this great image is destroyed by a small stone made without hands. And Daniel says that the image represents the rise and fall of 4 world empires, and the stone represents a kingdom that God would set up. And at the end of this, the king praises God and exalts Daniel along with his 3 friends. And within this chapter, there's just so many things, but one of them is that God is the revealer of secrets, that God, it says things like that in other parts of scripture as well. God knows everything. He knows the past, the present, and the future. He knows the thoughts of our hearts, the thoughts of everyone's hearts. He knows treasures that are in dark places. He knows the purpose of things that we are finding hard to fathom. God is the revealer of secrets. And I think, we can all be challenged to spend more time, can't we, in his presence, allowing him to reveal things to us, things consistent with his word, of course, but to make sense to us of the things that are going on at any point. And as well, the other major factor of this chapter is that God can make known the future and bring it to pass. And of course, there's so much here about the kingdom, isn't there? The kingdom that the God of heaven will himself set up, the kingdom which will never be destroyed, which will consume other kingdoms and stand forever. And we have many questions to ask about that, I guess. So just to go back to the dream for a moment, verse 44, in the time of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. And as I've said, Daniel speaks of this dream as being of the four kingdoms, and he's very clear that the starting point is Babylon, which is helpful, isn't it? Because it's useful to know where we're starting in world history. And world history confirms to us the next three kingdoms. So Babylon is overcome by the Medo-Persian Empire, and that's represented by the chest and arms of silver. Then we are followed with the Greek Empire, represented by the belly and thighs of bronze, and then the Roman Empire, represented by the legs of iron with feet mixed with iron and clay. And so if we understand it like that, and I know there's some debate, but the majority of scholars end up with that as their main understanding. And the division of the Roman Empire, and of course we're looking for a kingdom to come in the time of Rome. It's interesting, isn't it, that the empires succeeding Babylon were inferior to Nebuchadnezzar's head of gold, in the sense of the centralization of absolute power he had. He was an absolute monarch, and that succeeding empires were progressively less so. They were larger, they lasted longer, but they were less centralized in terms of power than Nebuchadnezzar, where it was an absolute autocracy. So Persia was what you call a monarchical oligarchy. So it had nobles equal to the king in all but office and represented by the silver. Greece, again, a lower level, of course, aristocracy of the mind and influence, and Rome was a democratic imperialism with military dominion. So, there's different things going on there. And the Babylonian Empire stood for 66 years. I know that you think this is really important. The Medo-Persian Empire for 208 years. Really long time, isn't it? The Grecian Empire for 185 years. And the Roman Empire for more than 500 years. Amazing, isn't it? So as we come towards the end of that, we see that this final world empire is going to be a mixture of clay and iron. It will have the image of strength more than its substance. And it will seem invincible, but actually it will be unstable at its base. And therefore, one significant blow to the foundation could topple it all. And it's interesting, isn't it, I think, to see that this image is, if you like, a devolution more than an evolution. Instead of man beginning in dust and evolving into gold, this vision declares that man's dominion begins with gold and devalues into dust. And there's maybe something significant about that. And some 40 years from this point, Daniel has another vision, which we'll be looking at in a few weeks' time, describing the same succession of empires. And Daniel sees it from God's perspective, whereas Nebuchadnezzar much more from man's perspective. So the dream is certain and its interpretation is sure. Daniel doesn't guess. He doesn't ask 20 questions. He listens to God, and he's listened to his culture, and he speaks the word of God to the king. And there's a kind of a really, kind of a long-term story in here, isn't there? That actually empires rise and fall. And, we may not see the rising and falling in our lifetime. None of the, well, I think apart from the Babylonian Empire, none of the others anyone lived to see the beginning and the end. We may not ever see that, but we can have a confidence that whatever empire rises, it will also fall, because only the kingdom of God will last forever. And I think that as we look at world history around us right now, it would be reasonable to express a reasonably high level of anxiety about some of the empires that are rising up. Along with everything else this week, I managed, and some others as well, to join in with the World Watch List at Parliament, which normally can't do because it's just too much effort to go to London. But we were able to watch it online. In fact, you can still watch it online on the Open Doors YouTube channel. And they presented the World Watch List for 2021 and the top 50 countries. Now, so many of you will have seen the map over the last years. And normally, of those 50 countries, there's a graduation. So some are yellow, they're in the bottom part, and then they're orange, and then red is the acute ones in the top 10. Well, this year, for the first time ever, the top 50 countries are all in the orange and red zones. It takes another 24 countries before you get beyond yellow. So there would be around 75 countries that would have in previous years been in that top 50. There's something striking about that. The rise of India and Prime Minister Modi, and the way that he is very subtly but effectively persecuting the church. The power of India economically. India is now 9th in the World Watch List. The rise of China, and as I already said, the place where they stand in terms of the persecution of believers. The empires like North Korea that just seem to keep on standing despite it all. They keep standing. And even, the situation which we were watching unfold pretty much this time last week in the USA, who'd have ever believed that? And so on and so forth. We could go on and talk about this for hours, really. But it's that confidence that whilst empires rise, they also fall. And that God is in control of human history, and there will be a day when that stone comes for the final time and all empires fall before the kingdom of our God and our Christ. And Nebuchadnezzar falls on his face in front of Daniel. I think if I'd been Daniel, I might have been slightly worried that he wasn't going to take that approach, but he does. And he appoints Daniel to the senior place in his kingdom. Reminds us of the story of Joseph, doesn't it? And he recognizes, at least at some level, that God, Jehovah, is the God of gods. We don't know what went on in his heart, but he says that out of his mouth. He recognizes that this is not just Daniel himself, and he spares Daniel and he promotes him and his friends. And of course, it's impossible for us to read this without our thoughts going forward, isn't it, to the time of John the Baptist, who proclaims that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And Jesus saying that the time has now come, this moment in time, and that this indestructible kingdom is being raised up in the time of Rome. And it just, to me, just makes sense. I don't know if it makes sense to you. It makes sense to me that in that moment, on a day, in a place, there was that bridge between heaven and earth. There was that incarnational bridge of Jesus Christ born. And in that moment, in terms of human history, the kingdom of God began to roll. And we knew that kingdom was rolling out. And it was pretty invisible for the first 30 years to many. And then for 3 years, It was visible locally. And yet we know that at the cross, that definitive moment of destruction of all human empires was going to come one day forever. And so often that the examples being used of D-Day and VE Day, and I think it's because there's not a better one really, that there was a decisive victory on that day, which gives us hope for what is to come. And when I look at the world news, and we live in a obviously relatively safe and secure scenario, but if I was a believer in North Korea today, or in one of the Stan countries, or in India where persecution is growing almost daily, or Nigeria where the level of violence against Christians is more than in any other nation in the world, the level of violence, then that is the most important truth and foundation for life, isn't it? That the kingdom of God will overcome, and that it will rise like a mountain and fill the whole earth. And we have that hope that we are part of that kingdom. And whilst our passport, whether it's red or blue, might say that we're citizens of the UK, and unless you happen to be a citizen of somewhere else, we know that our real long-term citizenship is in heaven, and that's a kingdom that will endure, and the passport colour will never be changed. And our ruler is above every principality and power and might and dominion. And Hebrews reminds us that every principality and power has been made subject to him, but we don't see that yet, but we have it as our hope. And that in Revelation it reminds us that he is the ruler of the kings of the earth, and he rules the nations with a rod of iron, and he has all authority in heaven and on earth. And we will be looking at this again, most definitely in Daniel chapter 7, and maybe in some of the other more apocalyptic parts of Daniel, which we will get to. But I think today, with all that's going on in our world, it's really important for us to remember these truths, and to be those people in our culture who have that double listening, who are listening to God and who are looking and listening to our culture. And I don't necessarily even mean that on a big brushstroke scale, but what's going on in our family, in our workplace, such as it might be, in our friendship group, in our street, in our community, in the UK, and saying, what is God saying, and how can we appropriately speak his words, his ancient word, in an improvised way that communicates and connects with those who are around us. So well done for hanging in there. It's a big chapter, that one, and you've done really well. And next week we get to a familiar story again, and it's a little bit shorter. So thank you for being with me. I hope that encourages you. I hope it informs your prayers as well. Really encourage you to watch the World Watch List presentation. Bit of interesting sound at times, but really fantastic. And some of you will remember when Fiona Bruce came and spoke to us at Cafe Church about Christians in politics, and she's been MP for Macclesfield and Congleton, I guess she still is. And she's been appointed the new envoy for religious freedom for the government. So, let's pray for her. She's a follower of Jesus, and for her to have influence. It's not always easy to have influence, even if you want to. So let's pray for her, and for other MPs who are seeking to have that influence, and who believe that the kingdom of God is what really matters. So nice to see you, and I'll see you again, online somewhere, on a Zoom somewhere. And enjoy the rest of your evening, and also be careful tomorrow. The temperature's super low in the morning, so judging on how wet it is out there, I think it might be a bit skiddy. So Helen Parsons, no skidding. I'm gonna just be careful because I think it will be slippery. Thanks everybody. See you soon.